Hey guys, we're excited to partner with upcoming YouTuber James Lee of 5149. He's going to explain culture, politics, anything else that needs explaining, and we're really excited about it.
Yep, here is his latest effort. Let's get to it.
Hey there, my name is James Lee. Welcome to another segment of 5149 on Breaking Points. Today we are going to look to understand China's unique form of autocracy to hopefully illuminate how power structures and incentives in China and the United States manifest in policies that deeply impact the lives of its everyday citizens. And I think the most useful lens for understanding China is the country's pandemic response policies over the past couple of years.
这个是正常的叫，好了，终于2分钟，所有人都在叫，要命了！就刚刚5分钟前头，俺叫完没几个了，现在突然之间，所有人都叫了，要死！要命了！再这样弄下去，我讲真的要出事体了，麻烦了。根治上面呢，因为所有的人，伊都不晓得这个状态到底维持到啥个辰光。侬总要把个标准，或者是讲有一个。
I'm sure many of you have seen some disturbing footage like this coming out of China in recent weeks, as some of China's largest cities, including Shanghai, with a population of more than 26 million people, have been under a strict lockdown amidst a recent COVID-19 outbreak in pursuit of their zero COVID strategy. According to New York Times reporting, quote, Mr. Xi, he's the president of China and the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, is keen to stick to this strategy, the zero COVID strategy, because he is seeking a third term at an important Communist Party Congress later this year. He wants to use China's success in containing the virus to prove that its top-down governance model is superior to that of liberal democracies. Yeah, I think without a doubt, there is an intensifying battle between two economic and geopolitical superpowers, China and the US, and the seemingly diametrically opposing cultures and values they represent, one being democracy and individualism, and the other being authoritarianism and collectivism. And I think in the West, we have watched with kind of confusion and horror at how, just how extreme a position China has taken in terms of their zero COVID policy, with very little acknowledgement or discussion about the inherent trade-offs of such an extreme strategy, such as the mental and physical health impacts of an indefinite lockdown. But I think in order to make sense of this policy, we have to understand how the Chinese Communist Party is organized, the incentive structures in place, and what kinds of behavior is rewarded. I'm going to read a little passage from the DIPLOMAT, a current affairs magazine focusing on the Asia-Pacific region. Quote, scholars such as Kevin J. O'Brien describe the Chinese state as responsibility-driven, meaning local officials operate under what is known as a cadre responsibility system. The cadre responsibility system evaluates the performance of local cadres based on their fulfillment of assigned policy goals. During mobilization, the task from the top leadership becomes the priority, outweighing all policy goals in the cadre responsibility system. Under the current zero COVID policy, the task of preventing a COVID-19 outbreak outweighs the imperative of economic growth, usually the most critical policy goal in the cadre responsibility system. So you take this overarching national strategy of zero COVID, and just to give you a little bit of a visual, the directive funnels down from President Xi and his small group of senior officials known as the Politburo to the local Communist Party officials to implement. Many of these lower junior officials would, of course, have ambitions to move up the food chain, and if their performance, loyalty, future prospects, etc., are based on this one policy goal, with the most important metric being 0 cases of COVID, then that doesn't leave much choice but for them to double down with some pretty extreme measures, along with sacrificing other priorities and duties to ensure that China stay COVID-free. And such an imbalance between the demands and incentives of the government officials and the needs of the people can have extremely harsh consequences for the general public, something that I think critics are worried about rightly right now with China's zero COVID policy. Now, taking it one step further, with the numerous entanglements between the public and private sector in China, one might think that, like the United States, billionaires wield as much, if not more power than any one government official. But in China, that's not necessarily the case. Take the Chinese government's response to their most famous billionaire, Jack Ma of Alibaba, as an example. This is from the Wall Street Journal last year. Quote, during a visit last summer to Hefei, a Chinese city northeast of the epicenter of the COVID-19 outbreak, Mr. Ma invited medical workers to a hot pot banquet to show his appreciation. A local media report referred to him as, quote, Teacher Ma, and said he sang opera for the guests. Senior leaders were annoyed, according to a person familiar with the matter. Beijing took credit for China's COVID-19 response, and some officials thought it wasn't Mr. Ma's place to thank frontline workers. That's right, it's not a billionaire's role to thank workers. It's the responsibility of the Chinese Communist Party. They don't want any allusion to the idea that the private sector can be an answer to a challenging situation or problem, with even something as trivial as a thank you hot pot banquet to send a message that China only has one leader in a time of crisis, as the Wall Street Journal headline alludes. And I think unlike the US, where I think, pretty much we have this common idolatry of the billionaire entrepreneur and this narrative that business can do a better job than the government, in China, you could be a billionaire tech entrepreneur, but the head of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, still calls the shots.
There's no way a group of billionaires could control the Politburo, as billionaires control American policymaking. So in China, you have a vibrant market economy, but capital does not rise above political authority. Capital does not have enshrined rights. In America, capital, the interest of capital and capital itself has risen above the American nation. The political authority cannot check the power of capital.
That was Eric Li, a Chinese venture capitalist and political scientist. And I think I'm going to repeat what he said once again, because I think it explains so much. Because in China, as he said, capital does not have enshrined rights. It doesn't rise above political authority. But in America, capital and the interest of capital has risen above the American nation, and political authority is actually unable to check the power of capital. And we see this in practice all the time. On December 21st of last year, Delta Airlines CEO Ed Bastian asked the CDC to shorten the COVID-19 isolation period from 10 to 5 days. And lo and behold, a few days later, on December 27th, the CDC updated and revised their isolation and quarantine guideline from 10 to 5 days. Many have suggested that the motivation for the change in the guideline was economic rather than scientific, and I think with some pretty good reason. Quoting Dr. Fauci, with the sheer volume of new cases that we are having and that we expect to continue with Omicron, one of the things we want to be careful of is that we don't have so many people out. Dr. Anthony Fauci, the Biden administration's chief medical advisor, told CNN's Jim Acosta. I mean, obviously, if you have symptoms, you should stay home. But if you're asymptomatic and you're infected, we want to get these people back to jobs, particularly those with essential jobs to keep our society running smoothly. In the case of Delta, staffing was and remains a major issue for the airline industry as a whole, and having a shorter quarantine period would certainly help the cause. Also, a bit of the quiet part out loud there for Dr. Fauci, admitting that the change in quarantine length isn't necessarily scientifically driven, but rather to mitigate economic disruption, I think, which is a clear deviation from past messaging that asymptomatic infection fueled the spread of COVID-19 and that folks should stay home until testing negative. Another example, President Joe Biden, to his credit, has, at least in rhetoric, continually called for intellectual property waivers on the COVID-19 vaccines, and at last year's WTO meeting said that the discovery of new variants demonstrates that the pandemic will not end until the entire world has access to vaccines. But he, along with the rest of the US government, have been continually thwarted by massive lobbying efforts and the power of big pharma. And so, like we just talked about before, in the United States, with money being the number one interest of the country, political authority is actually not capable of checking the power of capital. Wealthy individuals and businesses almost always get their way, while in China, the interest of capital cannot rise above political authority, because in China, the number one interest is, of course, to preserve the Chinese Communist Party. We talked about Jack Ma earlier, and this is once again from the Wall Street Journal. Quote, Mr. Ma failed to keep pace with Beijing's shifting views and lost in appreciation for the risk of falling out of step, according to people who know him. He tuned out warnings for years, they said. He behaved too much like an American entrepreneur. Mr. Ma's exit from the world stage followed a typically frank speech in October when he criticized Chinese regulators for stifling financial innovation. Mr. Xi personally intervened days later to block the record $34 billion plus initial public offering of Ant Group, Mr. Ma's financial tech company. So money does not talk in China, unlike in the US, where money not only allows you to buy influence in public policy. This is a quote from Jacobin magazine in reference to Bill Gates. Quote, this is a private billionaire in Seattle at the highest levels of scientific discourse, the New England Journal of Medicine, telling governments what they should be doing. So right, capital allows billionaires to bend the ear of not only the politicians, but also academia. And it can also be used to shield you from any media criticism. Quote, if you're a journalist covering global health, the Gates Foundation should be one of your most important targets, but it can't be if it's funding your newsroom. So in America, policymaking and capital are inextricably intertwined, with the country's number one interest being to protect capital at all costs. But on the other hand, in China, they've been willing to put economic considerations on the back burner. I think Forbes estimates about $46 billion a month in pursuit of zero COVID. I live in the US, and I think so do a lot of the audience watching this video. And I think in the US, at least in the Western world, we think, we look at a country like China and think, yeah, man, I'm glad I don't live there, because look at all the human rights violations, now the indefinite lockdowns in some cities, with other cities watching on knowing that it could be them next. Not to mention the strict speech, information, and media censorship under the Chinese communist regime. But I think what's important to note here, in regards to something like censorship and free speech, which I find quite interesting, is that in China, sure, the government decides who can and cannot speak and what you can and cannot say. But in the US, the government doesn't censor people. Capital does. Even government officials like Marjorie Taylor Greene and, of course, former President Trump can actually be censored by corporations like Twitter. Although, now with Elon Musk's takeover, that could very well change. But once again, that change is based on the whims of capital and not the government. So in a way, the freedoms and liberties of citizens in both countries are infringed upon by different groups of people and in slightly different ways. My point, of course, is not to be pro-China or anti-America, vice versa, or to draw any kind of false equivalency between these two countries, but rather to hopefully illuminate and understand the underlying incentives and priorities driving the policymaking and the trade-off decisions, because the truth is, both countries seek to preserve something. In China, the number one goal happens to be preserving the Chinese Communist Party. And so sometimes the Chinese government will sacrifice the rights and the well-being of its citizens to preserve their power. In the United States, the number one goal is, of the current bipartisan consensus, is to protect capital, corporations, and the wealthy. And so sometimes the US government will sacrifice the rights and the well-being of its citizens to protect the interests of capital. Now, I'll let you draw your own conclusions on which you prefer, but for me, if the primary purpose of government is to protect and provide for the well-being of its citizens, and if you share that similar vision, the truth is that any government, democratic or otherwise, whose primary function is either to preserve power or protect capital, could never truly prioritize the well-being of its citizens. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion about China. If you'd like to know more about this topic and many others, please check out my channel 5149 with James Lee on YouTube, where I release weekly videos relating to the intersection of business and politics, and as well as society. The link will be in the description below. Of course, subscribe to Breaking Points, and thank you so much for your time today.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.